Replace our inputs with the new enhanced input system. This video is really just for people that are using Unreal 5 because it's a new feature that is only available in Unreal 5, obviously, so it doesn't affect most of you, but since a bunch of people asked me that feature for over 6 months now, I think, I decided to do it anyway. And actually, I'm a little bit obligated to do it because with Unreal 5.2 that is coming pretty soon, Epic is going to remove the old input system completely from the engine, so if we want to continue using Unreal with this project, we need to convert our inputs to the new enhanced input system, and I also need to do it for the marketplace because I still want my project to be available on the marketplace. So yeah, I really need to do the switch, so let's get to it. So in Unreal, the first thing to know is that the new enhanced inputs is a plugin in the engine. It's a new plugin that we have to enable to be able to use it. Actually, you have to enable it manually if you're using Unreal 5.0 like I'm doing right now, but if you're using Unreal 5.1 or Unreal 5.2 or other versions, it should be enabled by default because it's going to be the new default input system from the engine. But in my case, since I'm still using Unreal 5.0, I'm just going to go in my plugins and enable it manually. So in there, I'm going to look for enhanced input, which is at the top, if I don't make a typo in there, enhanced input right here, and I'm going to enable the plugin. Unreal tells me that it is a new beta plugin and it's a little bit unstable, but I know that it works pretty well, so I'm just going to accept and restart my engine. And now that Unreal is reopened, I can start using the plugin, and if you want to know if the plugin is active, you can just right-click in the content browser and you should see the new input category that we have right here to be able to create some input assets that we have right here. These assets are going to be used to replace the old input system. So since we are going to replicate the old inputs that we already did in the project, I'm going to also open the project settings to see the previous input that we had in the project. So in the project setting, I'm going to go in my inputs, which are somewhere here. Here we go. And now we can see that we already have a few actions and a few axes right here, and we're going to replace those by the new input system. So let's go do that. I'm gonna go in my main menu. I'm gonna go in my folder next to my player, so in Blueprint Core Player right here, and I'm going to create a new folder for my inputs. So new folder, inputs, here we go, and now I'm gonna go inside the folder, and in here I'm going to create as many input actions as we have in the project settings. Actually, not really, I'm going to remove a few of those, but that's the basic idea. We have to recreate those inputs right here inside the content browser. So we need an input axis for the zoom, the move forward, right, the rotation right and rotation left of the camera. So I'm gonna go back in my content browser right here, right click, and I'm going to create a few input action. So let's just create a few input action, input action, input action. So here we go. I have 3 inputs right here, and I just renamed them, so I didn't do anything else. So I have IA underscore camera underscore move, IA underscore camera underscore rotate, and IA underscore camera underscore zoom. So these are the 3 input action we're gonna use to affect the camera in the game. They are the same exact inputs that we have right here in the project settings, but they are renamed, and I combined a few of them together. So I combined both rotations together and the input axis forward and right, I combined them into the move camera instead. So I combined a few of those, but the idea is the same. We have the same inputs right here. So now I'm just going to open them to define them because they are pretty empty. I didn't add anything in there yet. So now we just have empty inputs that we have to configure ourselves. Okay, I just reorganized my windows a little bit so we are able to see the inputs in the project setting as well as the actions that we are going to configure to replicate what we have in the project setting. So it's just going to be a little bit simpler if we can see both at the same time. So good. Now we're going to start with the camera move. So to move the camera, what do we want? We want an input axis that is called every frame that we are holding the button down to continuously move the camera in that direction. So if I'm holding the right key on my keyboard, I want my camera to move on the right again and again and again until I release the right key. And that's what we were doing before with the input axis, the axis mapping that we have right here, not the actions. So don't look at the action right now. We are going to create an axis mapping, and by default, all the actions that we create are action mapping. They are not axis mapping, and that's determined by the value type that we have right here. We have a boolean, which is either true or false, depending if you are pressing the key or not. True when the key is down, false when the key is up. The same way as we were processing the action mapping before. When we are pressing on one of these keys right here, when we are pressing E, we're going to rotate the camera only one time, but for the movement of the camera, we want to continuously move the camera while we are holding the button. So we don't want to have a boolean right here. We want to have a float, which is an axis mapping right here. You can see it, axis 1D, and that's the default axis that we had before. All of these are only axis 1D. They are only controlling one direction. In our case, we had one input for the forward direction and one input for the right direction. But in my new case, what I want to do is to combine those two axes together in the camera move. We want to be able to move the camera in both axes at the same time. time. So we're going to use the axis 2D. We're going to have two axes, one axis for the forward backward direction and one axis for the left right direction. So we're going to combine those two axes together using the axis 2D right here. Here we go. So now we have an axis mapping that is actually combining two axis mapping at the same time. Okay, that's good. Now we decided if we wanted an action mapping, or in our case an axis mapping. So we decided that now we have to tell the action, the input action right here, if we want to trigger that action, let's say every frame or only once when we are pressing the button, when we release the button or things like that. We have to tell it ourselves when we want the input to be triggered. So that's going to be inside the triggers right here. So let's add a new trigger and we'll see what's going to do. So in the trigger, I'm going to add myself a new element and I want to trigger this input when, let's say, when the button is down. So when I'm holding, let's say, the right key on my keyboard, it's going to continuously call this input while the button is down. So that's actually exactly what we want. So okay, good. I looked at the first one and that's the one we want. So that's good. But I'm just going to look at the other ones that are going to be interesting today. The hold is a little bit confusing in my opinion because it's only triggering once after a short period of time while we are holding the button. So if you're holding, let's say, the right key for like a second, it's going to trigger the hold after 1 second. If that's what you decided, you can decide that delay. Obviously, you can make it anything you want. So if you want an action to be triggered only 2 seconds after you are holding one button down, let's say you're loading something or whatever, you can simply hold the button down and that's going to be called only if the player kept that button down for X amount of time. So I think that's a little bit confusing because we technically want to have the hold for our movement of the camera, but it's not really the hold that we want to use. We want to use the down. And the other one that is interesting is the press. So that one is only triggered once when we press on the button, which is exactly what we are going to need for the movement, the rotation of the camera that we have right here. So we're going to use the press when we press the button to trigger the rotation of the camera. But in this case, since we are inside the movement of the camera and we want to continuously move the camera while the player is holding down the button to move the camera, we're going to use the down trigger that we have right here. Here we go. So that's it. We configured our first input action to move the camera. Now it's time to go to the second one, which is going to rotate it. And so for the rotation, that one should be a little bit simpler because we were using action mappings before. So that should simply be a boolean only telling us if we are pressing the button or not, and that should be enough. But in my case, I actually changed a few things and now we are combining the left and right directions together inside the rotate action and the rotate input. So we have only one input that rotates the camera, either right or left, but we need a way to tell the code if we press the left key or the right key. We don't know that. So that's why we're going to change the value type to an axis 1D instead of a boolean, because we don't only want to know if we pressed the key, we also want to know which key we pressed. And we're going to use the axis, only one axis. That's why we're going to use the 1D axis, only the left-right axis, only one direction. And we're going to use that axis to tell the code if we want to rotate the camera on the left or on the right, depending on which key we just pressed. Okay, good. Now we have the axis and we just need to trigger the input when we press the button, the same way we were doing before, only a one-time thing. When we press the button once, it's going to trigger the camera rotate, telling the camera to rotate either left or right. And that's going to be in the triggers right here using a pressed trigger, pressed. That one is only called once when we press the key. And that's exactly what we want. It's going to act the same way it was doing before with the action mapping, only be called once when we press the key. Perfect, save. And we're going to use the axis to tell the code, okay, we want to go left or right. That's as simple as that. Perfect. Now it's time to go do the zoom. And that one is super simple because we already know how it works. So when we are creating a new axis mapping, we need a direction. So at least a float. So an axis 1D, 2D or 3D. In our case, we only want to go either forward or backward. So zoom in or zoom out. So we only need one axis and that's going to be the 1D axis right here. That's good. That's as simple as that. And now the second thing we have to decide is when we want to trigger that event. So when we are scrolling on the scroll wheel. So every time the value is not equal to 0, so the scroll wheel is not triggered, we're going to continuously move the camera either forward or backward. So we're going to use the down trigger right here. So as long as the mouse wheel is scrolling as over and over and over and over, scroll, we're going to move the camera for all those frames. And that's what the down is going to do. Perfect. So we're done configuring all three inputs right here. And now we can go back in the content browser to assign keyboard keys to those inputs. So I'm just going to reorganize my windows again. Okay, good. So as I said, to be able to assign keys and buttons to the inputs, we have to do it through a new asset because right now we can see that in the project settings, we were able to assign keys to those actions, but we're not able to do it directly inside the input right here. So we have to create a new asset to be able to do that. So right here in the content browser, I'm going to create a new input mapping context that we have right here, and that context is going to tell the player which inputs are associated to which button in that specific context. In our case, we're only going to have one context in the game, so I'm just going to name it IMC_default, the default context of the game. Perfect. So now let's open that. And in here, we're going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to assign keys to our different actions. So let's add a new mapping first. The mapping we're going to do is the move. So we need to assign keys for all of our different mappings. So I'm actually going to add all of them right now. So move, rotate, and the third mapping is going to be the zoom. Here we go. We have all the different mapping that we can use to affect the camera in the game. And now we have to assign keys to those mappings. So for the move, we're going to go forward, backward, left, right. So I'm going to have a bunch of keys in there, actually the same ones that we have right here, WASD, up, down, left, right. So I'm just going to start reassigning it. So right, and then we have another one for the D, and then we have left, so left, and then we need the A, and then we have forward, so up, we have W, finally we have backward, so down, and we have S. Here we go. So we have WASD, left, right, up, down. Here we go. So these are all the keys for the move. Now we're going to do the same thing for the rotate. So for the rotate, we have two keys. We have the Q and the E. So turn the camera to the left or to the right. And finally, for the zoom, we have the mouse wheel axis. So mouse wheel axis using the wheel of the mouse. But we're not quite done because as you can see on the left right here, we have a few -1 here, here to tell the inputs if we are going left or right or forward or backward, or if we are zooming in or zooming out, and all those minuses we have to replicate them right here. And the way we're going to do that is by using modifiers on top of the inputs. So here we have the mouse wheel axis. Inside that, we can add a bunch of things. We can add the new triggers. So if we want to trigger more events for that specific input, we can do it here. Or in our case, if we want to add modifiers, we can do it right here, right under it. So add a new modifier. And in the modifiers right here, we can decide a few things. Do we want to apply a scaling depending on the FOV, have a dead zone, smooth the result, scale the result with the constant, or simply negate the result, which is exactly what we want. We want to invert the result of the input the same way we did before. Mouse wheel axis -1, that's going to do the exact same thing, -1 to the mouse wheel axis. Perfect. Now that one is negated, so it's going to go in the opposite direction, and we're going to do the same thing for the other axis that needs it. So when we're going right, it's going to go positive, that's good. D is the equivalent, that's good. Then for the left, we're going to do the same thing. So add a modifier, that one's going to be the same thing, negate. Same thing for the A. So when we go left, oops, not this one, we're going to add a modifier for the negate. Then up and W are going to be positive because we're going forward, that's good. But the down is going to be negative. So add a new negate right here. And same thing for the S, add a new negate. Here we go. So all these negates are doing the exact same thing as the -1s that we have right here. -1, -1, -1. Perfect. There's one last thing though. We have the Q and E right now. Before we were using two different actions to do them. So we didn't have to do anything because we already knew which input was pressed. But in our case, we have two inputs and we have to decide which one is going right, which one is going left. And in my case, I'm going to negate the E because that's how it's going to work. So I'm just going to negate one of those. So modifier, add it, and that's going to be negate on the E. So the Q is going to be right and the E is going to be left. Actually, opposite. The Q is going to be left, the E is going to be right. But anyway, if you negate the E, it's gonna work, so do that. Negate one of those, so we know either if we're pressing left or right. And that's it. All that was simply to replace those inputs that we have right here. So yeah, it's a little bit of a process. But now it's done and we're ready to use it in the game, so let's reorganize the windows once again. And now we're gonna go where we're using those inputs in the game, so that's gonna be inside the players folder in the BP pawn. So the pawn is responsible to control the camera. So inside the BP pawn, this is where we are receiving the input. So if I go in my event graph right here, we can see that we have a few inputs. We have the zoom, we have the forward backward, forward right I mean, and the rotation of the camera. So we're going to replace those events by the new events which is created. And so for the zoom, instead of using the old input axis zoom, we're going to use the new one, the IA camera zoom. So we can simply search for it, IA camera zoom. here we go, we have the enhance action event right here. I'm just going to take it and I'm going to use it to replace what we were using before, so that one right here. So the trigger is going to replace the old execution pin, and the axis value is going to be the action value now. Here we go, that's it, the zoom should work in game now. That's as simple as that. But it's actually going to be a little bit more complicated for the other ones because we're going to combine multiple axes together. Right now we had two events, one for the forward and one for the right. But in my case, I have only one event, the camera move. So I can just start by looking for it. IA camera move. Here we go. I have it right here. The trigger is going to also set the location desired. So I'm not going to need those two events anymore. So I can just delete those. Here we go. That's done. I actually don't need the location desired right here because we're going to set it only there at one place, but I'm going to combine the two axes. So I'm just going to replace the add that we have right here, add the location desired. I'm just going to connect it to the same place. Here we go. So I'm just going to do one addition, adding both the forward and the right vector at the same time. So we're going to calculate the movement of the camera forward and right at the same time, only one calculation, and then setting the location desired when we are holding the buttons down. And now it's simple, we're almost done. We just have to feed the action value to both those multiplies right here to multiply it with the location speed. But before doing that, I'm just going to normalize my action value first. So I'm just going to take my action value, normalize 2D, and then we can simply split and then connect the X to the X and the Y to the Y, and that's it. Now the camera is going to move in both axes, and the result is going to be calculated for both axes at the same time. And the only reason why I'm normalizing right here is because we have two axes at the same time. So if we press forward, for example, my action value is going to be 1, 0. So X and Y, it's going to be 1 and 0. But if we hold forward and right at the same time, both axes are going to be 1 and 1, which when we add together, it's going to result in 2, which means that the player is going to cover twice the distance when he is holding two keys at the same time. So when he is moving diagonally, it's going to move twice as fast, and we don't want that. We just want the player to move at the same speed all the time, and that's why we are normalizing it right here. And what the normalize does is simply bring all the values back between 0 and 1. So if I'm at +1 in X and +1 in Y, it's going to find the value in between those and normalize it on a circle. So it's always going to be maximum 1. Both values added together is going to be maximum 1. So it's just going to control the speed at which the player is moving to make sure that it is always the same speed, even if the player is holding multiple keys at the same time. But yeah, anyways, that's it for the movement of the camera. So now the last thing we have to do is the rotation of the camera. And here we're doing the same thing. We are using two events to rotate the camera, and we don't want to do that anymore. So I'm just going to delete all this right here. I'm just going to delete all of that also, and I'm just going to keep the rotation desired only once, and we're going to use the new event we created. So IA camera rotate. Here we go, my new event. I can simply connect the trigger to the rotation desired, just like that. And finally, we just have to use the action value to decide if we are going left or right, and multiply that by the rotation speed, so the camera rotates the same amount as before. So I'm just going to multiply right here by the rotation speed, and here we go. So now if I'm pressing my left key, it's going to go left. If I'm pressing the right key, it's going to go right, because this action value right here is going to be either +1 or -1 depending on the key we just pressed. Perfect, so we replaced all the inputs, and now I think we're ready to test them in game. So let's see how it goes. I'm gonna go in my main menu and press play. Now I'm gonna press on my keys and nothing happened. Yeah. Okay, yeah, because that's not as simple as that. Actually, we have actually two other steps we have to do to make it work in the game. So I'm just gonna press stop, go in my player pawn, and at the beginning, we're going to tell the pawn which context to use for its input. The context is the IMC default that we have right here, and if we go in the content browser, we have the IMC default that we have right here, because that context contains all the mappings of all the keys between the keyboard and the actions themselves, and that context you can switch it in game. We can switch it at any time in the game depending on the state of your game. So if you have different gameplays, you can swap the keys just like that. It's going to call different events automatically for you, and that's awesome. But it also means that you have to tell the player which inputs he's using, and in our case, we're not telling anything, so the player doesn't know what to do. So we're just going to do that inside the pawn. So here I'm in the begin play. I'm gonna go all the way at the end of the begin play, and we're going to set the context, which is simply going to be the default context, because in my game I don't have multiple contexts. I just have only one, so I can simply set it just like that. Here we go. I'm getting the owner of the pawn, which is the player. The pawn is always owned by the player. So here we go. I'm getting the owner of the pawn, which is the player controller. So I'm casting it to a player controller just to make sure that it is really a player controller. And then I'm getting the enhance input component that is inside the player controller. And on that component, we're going to tell it, okay, this is the mapping we want to use. And the mapping I want to use right here is the IMC default, obviously, because that's the new mapping we just created. So good. Now the player knows which input context to use. So that should work, right? Let's go back in the game and let's see. I'm gonna press play and move and nothing happens. Yeah. And that's something else. It's inside the project settings actually. In the current engine version I'm using, Unreal is still using the old input system by default, and we have to specifically tell it, okay, use the new input system instead. And that's right here actually, right under the old inputs in the default classes, we have to tell Unreal, okay, don't use the default player inputs, which is the old input system, but use the enhanced player input instead, which is the new system. And we're gonna do that for both those variables right here, enhance input component also. Now Unreal should really use the new system and not the previous system, which uses those old inputs that we have right here. Now it should use the right input. So now if I go in the game, I should be able to move my camera. So I'm going to move forward, backward, that's good. I can zoom out, zoom in, that's good. I can rotate the camera left, rotate the camera right, that's perfect. And I can move left and right. Yeah, no, I can't move left and right. It also moves forward and backward. Okay, I'm just gonna wait. Okay, there we go. That still moves my camera forward, backward, even though I'm pressing left and right, and that's not normal. Okay, that's forward, backward, that's good, but left and right is still moving forward, backward. Okay, that's a bit weird. And that's because we're never telling Unreal which axis to use in the pawn right here. I'm just going to go back to here. We're never telling Unreal when we press the button to feed the value inside the X or the Y, and by default, everything goes inside the X. So it doesn't matter if I'm pressing forward, backward, left, right, or any key on my keyboard, it's going to go inside the X by default. It's not going to feed anything inside the Y. So right now my Y is always 0 because I'm never telling Unreal, hey, use the Y instead of the X for those keys, and that's inside that mapping context right here, and we have to do it for all the keys that are not going to use the X value. So in our case, we want the keys that are moving left and right to feed the values inside the Y axis instead of the X, because the Y axis is the one responsible to control the right vector of our camera. So let's go back in the context right here, and for the right here, we're going to add a new modifier, and the modifier we want to use to feed the value inside the Y instead of the X is the swizzle input axis value. That's so confusing. I don't like the name, but that's the name I guess they chose for. So swizzle input axis value is used to feed the values inside the Y instead of the X, and that's the setting that we have right here, YXZ. Yeah, that doesn't mean much, but the tooltip says that it swaps the X and the Y axis, and it's useful when we are binding a 2D camera movement like we are doing. So that's exactly what we want. So yeah, it doesn't make sense. It's not too clear in my opinion, but that's how it works, and that actually works. So let's just keep it that way, I guess. So we are just going to use that modifier for all the keys that are going to feed the values inside the Y axis instead of the X. So that's going to be for the right, the letter D that we have right here. So the swizzle input axis value. Then we have the left that is obviously feeding the values to the left. So swizzle input axis. And finally the A key right here that we have, we can feed it into the swizzle input axis value. Here we go, modifier. Perfect. So, okay. Now that should be set up correctly, and now the camera should move left, right, up, down when we press on the keyboard, I hope actually. So forward, backward, that's good. Left, right, okay, that's good. Forward, backward, left, right, camera rotate left, camera rotate right, that's good. And then zoom out and zoom in, obviously. Great, okay, now we are finally done with the camera. The camera is now using the new input system and all the actions are working as before. But we're not quite done actually, because we have other inputs in the game that are not defined in the project settings right here. They are not defined right here, but we're using them in the game also, and that's inside the player actions. So I'm gonna go in my player actions to show you. In here, if we go in the event graph, we are using the left click, the left mouse button when we execute an action, and also the right click when we are executing another action. So we have to remap those buttons with the new system because they are still using the old system, obviously. So left mouse button, right mouse button right here. And finally at the bottom, we have the any key when we select a spell based on the number we press on the keyboard. So if we press on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's going to select the spell associated to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 keys. And that's what we were doing right here with the any key. So we're going to also remap that one. And that's going to be a little bit cleaner than using the events directly anyway. So let's go back in the content browser right here. I'm going to go in my inputs and I'm going to create 3 new inputs, one for the left click, the right click, and one to select a spell. So let's create 3 new inputs. Input action, input action, right here, and finally input action. And here they are. So I have IA underscore action underscore left click for the left click, IA actions underscore right click, and finally IA actions underscore select spell for when we want to select a spell. Now let's open these 3 to configure them a little bit. So all these 3 actions right here. And so for the left click, it's super simple. It's going to be a boolean, obviously, because we only want to know if the button is pressed or released. We don't care about the value of the button. Is it pressed? Is it not? That's it. That's what we care about. So yeah, that's a boolean right here. That's good. And then for the triggers, we're going to trigger the event when we press on the button. That just makes sense. So press. When we click on the button, it's going to trigger the event. But also, if I go back in my player action right here, we can see that we are also using the released event. So when we press on the mouse button, we do something. When we release the mouse button, we're going to do something else. And that means that we also need the released event. So I'm just going to go in my left click right here, and we're going to also add the release trigger. So right here, released. So this event, this left click event is going to be called when we press the button and when we release the button. That's good. That's done for the left click. And we're going to do the same thing for the right click. So we only care about the boolean if the click is pressed or not. So that's good. And then we need the 2 trigger, one's for the pressed event and one for the released event. That's it. That's good. That's going to be good enough for both the left click and the right click. And now we have the cast spell event. That one's going to be a little bit different. Technically, it could be a boolean and that will be fine. We only are interested if we are pressing a number or not on the keyboard, but we kind of also want to know which number we just pressed. Right now, if I go back in my code and if I go at the bottom, we can see that we were using the name of the key, and that's not really clean in my opinion. It works pretty well, but it's not really clean in my opinion. We just want to have a value right here for the index of the spell, and that value we can technically feed it from the button. Right now with the new event system, we can decide which value we want to feed based on the button we just pressed, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to feed a value from the input axis into the select spell function directly. So if I press on the number 3, it's going to feed it 3. If I press on the number 4, it's going to feed it 4. And the way we're going to do that is by simply converting this action to a float. So a float, it has a value associated to it, not only a true or false value. We're going to manually decide which value we want to feed to the event when we press on the key, depending on the key we just pressed. That's going to be inside the key mapping. But for now, we just have to set the triggers. So here I don't have any triggers. I'm going to set the triggers, which is going to be pressed. So when we press on the key, it's going to call the event like all the other ones. Perfect. So save all that. And now it's time to go add those input inside the input mapping. So inside the IMC default right here, we have all the previous mappings. I'm just going to collapse them and add the new ones. Okay, it reopens everything at the same time. That's not cool. But okay, we have the left click right here. I'm going to add the other ones. Okay, I'm just going to do that real quick. Okay, perfect. So I have my left click, right click, and select spell. And now we're going to assign the inputs that we want to use. So for my left click, I'm going to use the left click, obviously. For the right click, I'm going to use the right click, and for the select spell we're going to use all the numbers that are on the keyboard. So 1 for the first one, and then we're going to also okay, I'm gonna scroll all the way down, and we're going to use the number 2, and then we're going to use the number 3, and then we're going to use the number 4, and all of them. So I'm just gonna add all the other ones, add the keys, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 0. I have one too much. Here we go. And now I guess I can collapse all of that once again. Okay, perfect. So now we have the left mouse button, right mouse button, and all the numbers for the select spell. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 0 for the last spell. Here we go. And these numbers are going to select the associated spell using the value of the number. But right now we have to feed the value in Unreal because it's not done automatically. We have to tell Unreal, okay, when we press 1 on the keyboard, it's going to feed 1. When we press 2 on the keyboard, it's going to feed 2. When we press 3 on the keyboard, it's going to feed 3, etc. So I'm just going to go in my 1 right here, and I'm going to multiply the value of that number by the key we just pressed. So in the case that it's 1, I'm going to add a modifier, a scalar modifier. This is going to let me scale the value we are going to feed to the code. So in my case, I'm going to feed it by 1, multiply it by 1 because I pressed 1. In that case, it didn't really matter, but I want all my keys to be the same. That's why. So here in the 2, I'm going to add a new modifier, the same modifier, so the scalar modifier, which is going to let me multiply that value by 2. So now we're going to feed 2 to the code instead of 1. Same thing for the 3. So I can add a new modifier, scalar modifier, and then multiply the value by 3. There we go. Then 4, same thing. I'm going to add a new modifier, scalar modifier. I'm going to feed 4 to the code, and I'm going to do the same thing for all the other ones if I can do it. Okay, here we go. Now I'm going to do the same thing for all the other numbers. Here we go. So back from the top, when I'm pressing 1, I'm going to feed 1 to the code. When I'm pressing 2, I'm going to feed 2 to the code. When I'm pressing 3, 3, 4, 4, and then I'm going to scroll to show you all the other ones. But I have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 when I'm pressing the 0 key. So all these values are going to be fed to the code using the axis value that we're simply multiplying by that number right here. So now we are ready to go in the code and connect all those events. So in the player action right here, I'm going to replace these 3 events. So the left mouse button, right mouse button, and any key by the new one we just created. So let's search for them. I left click, which is the first one right here. And then we have I right click, this one right here. And finally, I select the spell. Here we go. Good. For the 2 first one, it's relatively simple. We just have to replace the previous action, but we don't have a pressed and released event anymore. We just have a triggered and completed, and the completed is completed at the same time as the trigger because when you release the key, it also triggers the triggers and then the completed because the event is completed. Anyway, don't think about that. Instead of using the pressed and release, we're going to use the value of the key. So is it pressed or is it released? The action value right here, it's telling you if it's pressed or if it's released. So I'm just going to use a branch right here. So if I can connect that to my trigger, so when the event is trigger, am I pressing the key or am I releasing the key? And we can simply use that to reconnect the previous event. So we can delete that one, we don't need it anymore, and now we can simply move this right here. Here we go, that's the same thing as before, and we're going to do the same thing for the right click. So for the right click, same thing, connect the condition just like that. Here we go. When the event is triggered, we're going to check if we just pressed the button or not. If it did, well, we're going to trigger the pressed, otherwise we're going to trigger the release, and just like that. There we go. So now we replaced both the left click and the right click, and that should work the same way it was working before. Now we have to replace the any key right here, and that's actually going to be super simple. Well, we don't need the any key. We don't need the display name, we don't need to convert it to a string, we don't need to check if it's a number because obviously it's going to be a number, and finally we don't need to convert it to an integer right here because, well, we have a float, so it's simpler to convert a float to an integer than it is from a string, so perfect. So now that trigger is going to call inside the branch as before, the branch going to be true, it's going to call the function directly, perfect, so that's simple. And finally we just have to feed the number right here, which is the action value, which is scaled by the number we have right here, so either 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 7, 10. Here we go. So these numbers are going to be fed inside the action value, and now we just have to round them to an end. So round. Here we go. We can simply connect them like so, and that's going to work the same way it was working before, but now we don't have to do any weird string manipulation to check the name of the key. We just have the value of the key that is fed directly by the input system. Perfect. So now I think we're ready to go test all that in the game. So let's see if it works. And here we go. Now I'm in my debug level. I'm going to move my camera to make sure it still works. So move around, left, right, zoom out, zoom in. That's all good. Everything works properly. And now I can move my mouse over the grid and I can trigger actions. So by actions, I mean, let's say add a unit in combat. Here we go. It seemed to work. Right click to remove. So the left click and right click seem to work. That's pretty good. If I hold the same way as before, it seems to work also. So that's pretty good. I can remove the units just like that also. That's awesome. And then I'm going to add a few units in the other team to be able to start a combat and test the numbers on the keyboard. So start a combat right here. And now I can move my unit around the same way I was doing before. And now I can click on my spell to cast them. That's super easy as before. It works well. And if I use the numbers on my keyboard, here we go. If I press 2, I can select the second key. And if I press 1, I can select the first spell. Here we go. So I'm able to switch between spell using the keys on my keyboard the same way I was doing before. So we didn't break anything, actually everything either. We didn't break anything because now everything works the same way it was working before. And that's pretty nice. We just switched to the new input system and that's awesome. Yay! Okay, I guess that's gonna be it for today's video and I'm gonna see you in the next one. Bye bye!